Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third and final day of this Human Rights and Climate Change Symposium. My name is Birsha Udedar. I'm a lecturer at the University of Essex at the School of Law and Human Rights Center. Today we have three sessions for this final day. The first session, which will start in a minute, is on energy provision in developing countries. After that, we have a session on climate change and the rights of a child. And then the final session looks at new perspectives, looking at the rights of nature. So please, you can use the same link essentially to join for the entire day. I'd like to extend a quick and special thank you to all of our partner organizations, Environmental Law Institute in Washington, DC, University of Beirut in Germany, University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, Global Environmental Rights Institute and Dignity Rights Project in the US, and Widener University Delaware Law School in the US. For all of these sessions today, there will be time for questions and answers. So we really welcome participants, attendees to ask as many questions as you'd like. While the session is going on, you can feed these into the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom. So if you put them in there, we can then relay these to the speakers at the end. We do apologize if we do not get to all of the questions, but do feed them in as they come up. Finally, please note that all of these sessions are recorded. It's also publicly available or live streamed on the Essex Human Rights Center YouTube channel. So therefore, if you wish, you may wish to anonymize yourself if you're posing a question. I will hand over now to Professor Toko Kaime, who will be chairing the first session on energy provision and in developing countries. Toko, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Birsha. I think it's critical to first welcome our panelists. Really grateful that they could make the time to be with us. This morning. We'll be discussing the issue of climate change and energy provision in developing countries. And with us here, we have Philippe Coulet from SOAS, and we also have Raphael Heffron, who is Professor for Global Energy Law and Sustainability at the Center for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at Dundee. And we have Professor Yinka Omorogbe. Now, I'm going to give a fuller biography for each of our speakers in a little while. I just want to say that in relation to this topic, it's important to note that energy is critical to all aspects of development, and that modern life is possible only because of the opportunities that are afforded by modern energy systems, from the simplest tasks such as cooking to lighting to heating. All these require access to modern energy systems, and governments around the world recognize the linkage between human development and access to safe and secure and affordable sources of energy. Now, for a lot of people around the world, access to energy means only access to very rudimentary and inadequate energy sources, which deprives most of these citizens the opportunities for economic development, as well as creating some serious health risks. And in those countries where access is adequate, there's also the issue that using fossil fuels generates greenhouse gases that contributes significantly to climate change, which is likely, again, to disproportionately affect those living in places where the energy systems are not so well developed. There are three important ways in which we can link energy to sustainable development. Energy as a precondition for upholding critical human rights imperatives, energy as a source of environmental stress, as well as energy as a key driver for economic growth. And these three dimensions correspond to the oft-cited three dimensions of sustainable development, the environmental, economic, and social. And so this panel is timely because limited access to modern sources of energy means that the majority of citizens around the world cannot enjoy their full human rights. And it's important that we start looking at frameworks to tackle what is essentially a pressing issue. Now, I would like to fully introduce our panel members who will be looking at elements of this conundrum of the issues that it poses. The first is Philippe Coulet, who is Professor of International and Environmental Law at SOAS. He did his doctoral degree at Stanford University, and then he also did an MA in Development Studies from SOAS, and he also holds an LLM from King's College. His research is on law and policy related to water and sanitation, and he'll be sharing perspectives gathered from a long trajectory of work in this field and how that can be applied to the problems of energy access. Professor Heffron, as I said, is at Dundee and is the Jean Monnet Professor in the Just Transition to a Low Carbon Economy, and was awarded this by the European Commission. Professor Heffron is also a qualified barrister at law and a graduate of both Oxford and Cambridge. And his work has a principal focus on achieving a just transition to a low carbon economy. So he is perfectly placed to tackle these issues about access, but also justice within our energy systems. I also would like to welcome Professor Yinka Omorokpe, who is Professor of Energy Law at the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in Abuja and Lagos. She has served as Attorney General for Edo State, served 2 terms as Attorney General. She's currently Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellow for 2021 and is chairperson for the Edo State Task Force Against Human Trafficking. She was adjunct professor from 2013 to 18 at the Center for Petroleum Energy Economics and Law at the University of Ibadan. And she has previously served as Dean in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ibadan. And so it is with a great pleasure that I welcome our panel. For today, I'm going to invite our speakers to speak for 8 to 10 minutes each. And then after they complete their speeches, then I'll invite them to comment or raise questions on each other's speeches. And this we'll do for 3 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to questions from participants in this forum. Okay, so with that, I hand over the floor to Philippe.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Sorry, there was a message disturbing my view. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's going to be a great discussion, I'm sure. And okay, we were, the chair of the panel told us that we were going to speak in terms of alphabetical order, but it may make sense because what I was asked to do is essentially maybe frame a broader context in terms of energy, water, and climate change, and that may then lead to the more specific discussion that we'll have afterwards. Okay, so since I have very little time, I will move on. In terms of an entry point, I thought the panel description gave us SDGs, so I thought it's a good starting point. We have 3 SDGs that reflect the 3 sectors, 7, 6, and 13. I don't want to highlight their content or their framing here. The only thing I'd like to highlight is the fact that none of these 3 goals are framed from a human rights perspective, and also that each is seen as a distinct sector, because there are some goals, and I'll come back to goal 10 in a minute, that try to link these goals together, but otherwise they're seen as separate sectors, which reflect very well the way in which the law and policy framework at international level is framed otherwise. The second interesting thing that we see here is that, okay, not directly in the short version of the SDGs, but is that each of these sectors is conceived as being extremely broad. They all overlap with each other, but they're considered as individual silos by people who work in one or the other of these silos. And it's proved very difficult over time to make links effectively between the sectors. Some of them more than others, but even the easy ones between, say, climate change and water, maybe slightly easier than with energy, have been difficult. Now, one of the ways to take the discussion further in terms of looking at what we do with these silos or with different sectors is to see what's already happened around us. One of the debates that's taken place for now more than a decade, since the late 2000s, is the so-called Nexus, which it's probably mostly people in the water sector who are familiar with it, but in principle it should be broader than that. That says that water, energy, and food, okay, we're not looking at food today, but that these 3 sectors should be considered together. So now, from our point of view, and I'm not coming back to food after this, it's very helpful in the sense that, for instance, we know that the overwhelming majority of the world's energy production is water intensive, hence there is a direct impact on water availability downstream or elsewhere, depending on whether it's groundwater or surface water, which is used. Secondly, there is also another link, which is that energy production itself may affect water quality, therefore water supply. And since here at the end, I'll come to the human rights dimension, we're first of all concerned about drinking or domestic water, hence that is an immediate problem. So now what linking through this nexus can help us do is try to identify energy sources that work across all the sectors. So let's say it could be water, energy, and climate change, because there's nothing that defines that nexus more than what the people who defined it in the first place. So we could decide to redefine it. The problem, okay, it's maybe a longer discussion, is that the nexus is rather technical in framing, and it does not allow us to look at the broader, and here I framed it in the easiest way, in a way of the most general entry point, as the justice perspective. And since we have discourses on water justice, energy justice, and climate justice separately, that's a good starting point. So as an example, is it wise, is it appropriate for cities, okay, the panel is on the global south, so maybe I didn't repeat it here, but let's say coastal dry cities in some countries of the global south to invest in desalination. Even if it's in terms of water availability, that seems to make sense, but there is a very high energy intensity which is involved in terms of producing that water and negative environmental consequences of the production of the water itself. Doing this rather than looking at how to provide and distribute water more equitably among a given city. And in lots of places, maybe not everywhere, but in the majority of places, the question of equitable access or similar access for all residents of a city is very often one of the key issues. So a small minority tends to appropriate most of the water resources, and if that was redistributed or reallocated, that could save us from needing, for instance, new sources of energy to produce more water. Now, moving on from the Nexus is really was framed from an economic, more from an economic perspective, which probably is not that different from sustainable development at some level, in terms of improving efficiency in the different sectors that we're looking at. This doesn't help us in terms of looking at entitlements or human rights, particularly because it's framed in that neoliberal understanding of benefits that will trickle down on their own without taking into account inequality. And inequality is really one of the increasingly key dimensions which are being considered but not addressed officially right. So here we have some help, SDG 10, reducing inequalities within and among countries. That's something which surprisingly, that's a separate discussion, only came in 2015. There was no such inequality goal before 2015, which help us make the links between the different sectors from a very different perspective that may look at, let's say, starting from the social perspective, for instance, including human rights later. Now, from a human rights perspective, there are multiple human rights dimensions to each sector, and because we don't have the time, I'm not saying anything more than that. I guess as a way to summarize or to simplify, for now, I'm looking more at the interactions of the human rights dimension between each other among the different sectors. Now, we know that there is no hierarchy between different rights, and in that sense, we're not very far from, again, the balancing act of sustainable development or the Nexus, but this doesn't help us to know what to do in a specific case of application, where at the end of the day, you have to prioritize somewhere, and you have to be able to do it in a constructive and rational way, which is often the problem. So justice, again, energy, water, climate justice can be an excellent entry point, but that still remains at a very generic level, and we need something slightly more specific. So in that sense, inequality is a good way to take the debate forward. So just to finish up, taking one example of what that may mean, multi-purpose dams can produce, for instance, hydropower and drinking water through transfer to, I'm assuming, an urban area, which is often the case. We seem to love hydropower from a climate change perspective since the beginning of the century, and diverting water for meeting the needs of urban citizens is always good, because in that sense, it contributes to the realization of the right to water. The problem is dams are also highly environmentally damaging. We keep forgetting that in some of the debates, whether it's upstream or downstreams. Dams also have the tendency to displace people when they're built in areas where people live, which means that there are human rights issues arising, both in terms of human rights being affected by displacement and the realization of the human rights of the displaced people. And then there is, again, the same issue in a way highlighted earlier, water going to the large city by definition, because it's major infrastructure, so it won't be for small cities, may bypass smaller cities or smaller rural areas on the way, and may not go preferentially to the poorest or the least favored in that city. So in a way, the problem we have, coming back to SDG 7, which is what we're supposed to be focusing on for this panel, I guess we'll only be able to realize it if we integrate lots of other dimensions, which will help us know how to move forward. It's not enough to just look at the goal in itself or the human rights dimensions arising from there in that sense. One of the ways, okay, I'm just throwing in one idea, one of the ways to do this is to rethink the individual nature of entitlement, which is the basic framework of human rights law at international level, as a way to reflect the fact that inequality is often structured around communities, groups, collective rights, or collectiveness, hence collective rights. At a very broad level, this is what SDG 10 calls for us to do, but because it does that outside of a human rights framework, and because its understanding of inequality is first of all framed in terms of economic aspects, it's also not enough for us to take the decision, the discussion where we need to take it. And okay, I've only overlapped by exactly 1 minute. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. Now I would like to welcome Raphael and his presentation. Raphael, please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much to Toko and all the conference organizers. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. And I'm going to talk on, I suppose, following up the previous talk and maybe going in directly into a bit more detail in terms of looking specifically at energy justice and human rights. And obviously connected with that, there are some climate change issues. So I won't say too much about myself. So Toko's already given a brief introduction, but I will just say that I do have some global experience on the issue, and that's the type of view that I'm trying to give, a mix of what's happening in the global south and global north. And I think in the energy sector, we just see things often through different lenses. But particularly for me, from the energy sector, the technology works the same way. And often, even some of the injustices are as a result of, they happen in the exact same way in different countries. You can get some more of my views, a small bit of self-promotion, but I've updated my views on energy law, 2nd edition, coming out next month. So for those who want to invest the time getting more an introduction to the legal perspective, you can find it there. So just where I'm speaking from in Dundee, just, point to relevance is we have this big energy transition happening here right next to our doorstep. It's where the oil and gas of the UK is located, and that's the big transition that we're facing in the UK. And that it's also of relevance because later this year, the COP26 conference will be happening over in Glasgow. Not as nice a city to visit as beautiful Dundee, but nevertheless, that's where the conference will be. And we should remember, from a legal point of view, this conference is big because this is where all the countries have to give their updates for what they're going to do for their energy and climate targets for 2030. So it is significant from that point of view. And this provides a big signal to, scholars, policymakers, investors all over the world. So this is, to me, a very big year to determine if we will meet our energy and climate targets. But, we can see some evidence of different action that is really engaging policymakers at the moment. And I would just highlight the issue in terms of, you know, I've talked about a few romantic cities already, Paris, Dundee, not so much Glasgow, but here's another one, Venice. And, you know, you can see here, you know, the poor young couple who, you know, their romantic holiday has been ruined by the floods in Venice, and we think of the climate change impacts. But I want to highlight a different example from the, let's say, the global south, and this is the city of Jakarta that announced just over a year ago 28 million people will need to be relocated by 2050. And they've already announced where the new capital will be, and I think they've already begun construction on the new capital city. But, you know, if we think, you know, of this large city with a greater population, 28 million people, that is a huge cost to policymakers. And this is why the climate change issues are becoming more and more sort of a dominant theme into the sort of policymakers' agenda, because they're realizing the huge costs that climate change is going to cost in future. And I just wanted to highlight three figures in terms of the energy sector, just to have in the back of your mind that 44 trillion of new energy investment will be spent by 2040. So I always say to my students, well, if you've come here to study energy, you know, you've made the right decision, because there's loads of money going to be spent in energy. There is going to be a continuation of jobs in the energy sector. And the only other sector nearly as big as energy currently today is health. So, I mean, if you know young people, you say, oh, well, what's your future career? You know, I'm sorry to say they should think about health or energy. I'm not quite so sure that family law, you know, would make the same, is going to create the same opportunity, but, you know, you never know. But 44 trillion by 2040, and we think all that money will be spent all around the world. And, you know, as was highlighted already, you know, the link there with water, you know, if you think of associated expenditure on something like water, and the rest of the economy, that figure actually goes up to 75 trillion by 2040. So we're talking huge sums here. But also worth having in the back of your mind is, in the UK, offshore wind has dropped in price by 66% in the last 8 years. In India, solar energy has plummeted in price too. They already met their targets 4 years ahead of schedule. They had a 20 gigawatt solar energy target by 2022. They met it in 2018. But by 2030, solar energy will be 56% cheaper than coal. So, I mean, to me, I don't think coal is a solution when we know in just a few years' time, you don't want to be locking into coal technology for 20, 25 years when solar energy is vastly cheaper. And remember, solar energy, particularly in the global south, can really target off-grid communities or smaller communities in a far easier way than, let's say, fossil fuel technology. But these figures highlight the huge amounts of money, and they also highlight the rise in cheap technology, that is clean technology. And what I want you to think about is, well, you know, really, what are the justice implications here? We do need a lot of expenditure in terms of the grid. There's a paper I can share detailing more on that. But here is the energy life cycle. So we think particularly of these activities where the 44 trillion will be spent, from extraction, production, operations, supply, consumption, waste management, and decommissioning. And what we want to see is justice applied through all of these 5 sectors. And what we want to think about is, you know, essentially the definition for energy justice is the application of human rights across these 5 energy activities. So that's what we are thinking about when we think about that 44 trillion being spent. So we can go into more detail and think that for project developers, there is increasingly a range of different justice risks, and these happen across the project life cycle. So not just thinking about planning and construction, but also operation and decommissioning. And increasingly, when you're borrowing the money for these energy projects globally, you have to deal with all these 12 justice risks that you can see here. So I'll just mention a few. One, insurance, increasingly hard for coal projects to actually get insurance in the first place. Other issues such as the rise in imagery and data and environmental impact assessment, very hard to get through these processes increasingly for big energy companies building fossil fuel projects, because you are able to say, well, this project did they were responsible for this particular damage in this country. Why would we expect them to behave differently in another country? So if they're doing this in a country in South America, will they behave differently in a country in Africa? And we can now see the imagery, we can see the data, and we can utilize this in decision making, and we can utilize this in the courtroom. And we can all remember just a few weeks ago the big decision limiting the corporate behavior of Shell, one of the biggest energy companies in the world, with projects in many places. And finally, the energy companies have to comply with the Paris Agreement, no longer just the governments, no longer just the citizens. So the free pass, as a word, that was nearly given to energy companies who are some of the biggest emitters of CO2 has in essence been taken away in the Netherlands. But we hope to see that this decision is copied in other countries around the world. And we can already see that there are some examples of other actions that are just as significant over the last few years. And very recently in Australia, it was established in one legal case that the Environment Minister has a duty of care to the young generation. And that was stated by the judges. They didn't elaborate on it, but it was stated by the judges in a case around a coal mine being opened. Then Switzerland last year had a referendum that would have forced companies who are headquarters, we know some energy multinationals are headquartered there, they would have to take account of potential environmental rights abuses and the liabilities that may arise from those abuses from those companies working, doing projects abroad. While that wasn't successful, it is quite influential. In the US, Joe Biden has got the climate change disclosure bill back on the table, and hopefully that can be passed. In Canada, they've been thinking about this for a few years. And remember, Canada has a huge amount of energy and mining companies who are headquartered there. And they introduced a Canadian ombudsman person for responsible enterprise to look at the alleged environmental human rights abuses of Canadian energy companies operating abroad. So what we can say and connect is we can create this energy justice circle where we think about energy justice, we think about the elements of justice, procedural, restorative, distributive, recognition, cosmopolitan. And if we look across the case law globally, so what we did in our study was look across 100 cases all across the world, and we can see these rights being mentioned in the legal decisions. So that, remember, the courts are the last place that you can go to get your rights protected, the last place you can hold companies to account, the last place you can hold governments to account, regulators to account. And we can see these different rights emerging: air, health, life, subsistence, water, environment, security, fair trial, culture, property, dignity. All these combinations being mentioned in the decisions, and they are being mentioned in case law around extraction, production, operations, supply, consumption, decommissioning, and waste management. So we call this the energy justice circle that is on the rise at the moment. And, again, just to finish off, you can read more about this in a book coming out also in later in August, thinking about the big challenge for energy justice is about correcting human rights in energy project developments. So thank you.
All right, many thanks, Raphael. Interesting observations drawn from a long period of sustained analysis on these particular issues. I'm sure our participants will have interesting questions for you. Okay, and now, last but not least, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Yinka Omorogbe. Yinka, again, welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Hello, can you hear me? You
Yes,
can.
we hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. Here, thank you very much for inviting me. And I think somehow we actually, like Philippe has said, I think we've gone in the right order, so to speak. I'm talking about what I would say is the forgotten South for the most part, and I'm talking about policy and law as instruments for the global realization of SDG 7. You know, when Raphael was talking about the money, when he was talking about the money, I thought to myself, how much of the 44 to 75 trillion is actually going to come into Africa? Because that is very much a huge problem that we have. Now, I'm concentrating really on SDG 7, and I accept the huge linkages and the huge issues that have to do with energy production, that have to do with water as well. And I have to say that I come from a region where water is a major issue. I don't know if many of you know that water is a driving force behind the terrorism and insecurity that we have in Nigeria with the drying up of Lake Chad. So they're really huge issues, and the challenge is to bring in all these different areas. So what I'm doing is concentrating on this, ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, because it actually is a big issue. So this is the primary problem that we have. The problem is the sheer numbers of people that have that lack access to modern electricity, the people that rely on biomass, basic biomass for cooking and heating. It is accepted that energy is a major contributor to climate change, accounting for the majority of the global greenhouse gases. And then, of course, we have the huge problem, which has a gender dimension, which is the problem of clean cooking. You have all these people, millions, a couple of million persons dying from the fumes that are inhaled. Now, the problem of clean cooking is very localized. So it's not global, and therefore it has received far less attention than it should have. Now, I have a problem, and that is that for some reason, my slide is not showing some of the pictures that should be there. So, sorry, I'm going back there to, I don't know. For some reason, the pictures that should come up, okay, the picture can't be displayed, I'm sorry. So I'll just go back again, because I do have pictures that actually make the point. And again, I have another picture here that makes the point, which is basically a hut in the, in a very rural area with one solar panel and some energy coming in. But the point I want to make is that very often when we're talking about access to modern energy services, we're often talking about these very basic connections that are a huge step if you are moving from basic biomass and having to fetch water 5 miles away. But they really won't lift you up out of poverty. They're great in that the children will be able to study if they're going to school, that is. But there is a lot more that needs to be done. So we actually need to think of what we're talking about when we're talking about the modern energy services, and there's quite a lot being done that way. So yeah, there's a problem. The energy poor live in Africa and South Asia. A lot of that money should come to the energy poor. It really should be there. I find that somehow we're a little bit forgotten, and I'm not saying that because I mean, even when I looked at Raphael's map subconsciously, he had all these 12 different issues, and he had one circle in Africa, and the other circles all round. And somehow that often seems to happen. A lot of them are there, and however, I will not say that it's a problem of the West. We have to have concerted and strategic effort. It has to really be planned for, and that is something that has been a major focus of some research that has been done by myself and a group of people in the past, and also personal effort by myself right now. The right policy and legal frameworks are essential if success is to be achieved. We always need to remember the two components of energy services. And so I need to always put clean fuels on the table, because we forget that a lot. We forget that a lot. Access to electricity is there, and we have to make sure that it's sufficient to lift people out of poverty. And that is why the multi-tier framework for me is very essential, because it talks about that, and it talks about the different aspects that are necessary. And so, of course, the different tiers are there, but keeping people in a certain region at tier 1 will take them nowhere. They're not even going to be able to get good internet connections. Clean cooking, grossly underfunded, not prioritized, even though it's the cheapest component of energy access. I have the personal view that if energy work was gender mainstreamed, this area would not be as neglected as it is now. And, I think that biomass cooking by poor women in a country that's thousands of miles away doesn't have much impact on investing entities. They can't identify with them in the same way. So it's good for us to talk about these different people. And of course, this highlights the necessity for gender mainstreaming, because it does have to be prioritized as an essential element. Of course, without going into much, that this has a huge impact. It would be it would help halt deforestation to a great extent, because they cut massive amounts of trees now for their firewood. There's so much, so much would happen if we did work in these areas. Now, in the area of electricity, the off-grid solutions are really critically important, and it's necessary for us to go and work more in these areas. But the important thing for us is to plan, and for us to actually have policies that are there, and measures to aid planning and track progress. I have mentioned some of them that are here. I like to emphasize and separate the law from the policy, because I find that usually for non-legal people there's an interchange between the two, but they actually serve very different functions. And indeed, a central premise of our research was that a lot of the time people were talking about the policy, which is soft, at the expense of that which is hard, and which holds legal persons accountable, so to speak. So the policies are great. The SDGs have been driven by global policies, have been driven by the pronouncements of the at the United Nations level, and they have to be supported by different legal initiatives. My take is that, the international human right of access to modern energy services, does it exist? Does it not? Generally speaking, one would say no. There isn't time to go into issues like this. It's treated as if it's a right in development quarters, and I think that is good. That helps to move the discussion forward. But I believe that it can clearly be situated within so many other human rights, from the first to the fourth generation, such as the right to development, which again some say is controversial, but at the same time is seen as, at the very least, it is well founded and grounded in ethics and morality. But nonetheless, the access to energy services is treated in a lot of quarters as an international human right. Municipal law has got a great role to play in this area. And so the states have a lot that they can do to ensure that the law is a stimulant. And I mentioned different areas. In fact, my premise is really that every area of law has a role to play in stimulating access to modern energy services. If people can really realize that having modern energy at your disposal really makes you, and if you don't have it, it breaks you. That is really the truth of the matter. Only a miracle will get you out. So there are different things. I mean, the law can support community-based financing. The law can enable the growth of renewables. I mean, I give different examples here. For example, in some countries, like in Sierra Leone, you have zero import duty on solar panels. In my country, you still pay. You still pay. So does that help solar in Nigeria? It does not. On the other hand, it's aided in a place like Sierra Leone and several other countries. So, I mean, I give different examples here. And again, I think that I don't know what has gone wrong with my screen sharing, because there should be more there. But a point I do want to make is that there are so many different ways in which the law can contribute towards making this a reality. Now, some countries have moved forward to a great extent. India is a very good success story in this area, and Ghana is also doing very, very well in achieving access and is pretty committed to it. My country a bit less so, and this is something we really need to work on. But I think I will end in the same way as Raphael. Apologize for whatever technology has stopped my pictures from coming up. And I'll end the way Raphael did by talking about a book that gives far more detail than I can possibly give in 10 minutes. And this is on ending Africa's energy deficit and the law. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be here and to discuss with everybody here and to hear and learn from everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Yinka, for those insightful observations. I think you raise a critical point here, and that's one related to how these projects can be financed. I read a recent contribution to the FT this month, where they were discussing some of the challenges that common when you're trying to finance big infrastructure projects in Africa. And one of the observations made is how risk in Africa is overpriced, and it doesn't match what the reality is on the ground. So this is a common problem. I remember working with partners at the Lloyd's insurance market. We would often see high prices for investments in Africa on the basis that the default risks were high, but the data showed, that it was about 6%, and it hasn't moved. And this is like towards the end of the 2000s, where the default risk remained in this range of around 6%, compared to other places like South America or South Asia. The default risks were higher, going up to 15%, and yet these other regions, the risk would be priced lower than that. And this is something that has not changed. I was reading this article and I was shocked that despite the data that is available discounting this, it's still more expensive to do what are safe projects in Africa. African states, African countries pay. This is what the data shows they pay back, they don't default. And yet the price for structured finance is higher for them. This does not make sense. And in the context where we are trying to build energy systems for the future, it doesn't help. Raphael was talking about the risks associated with lock-in. We build energy systems to use them for multi-decades, not just a couple of years. So the energy systems that we build now, we are going to have them maybe for the next 40, 50 years. And locking those energy systems to ones that are based on hydrocarbons, because they are cheaper, is a fundamental problem that developing countries need to resolve. But when structured finance makes it super expensive to build energy systems for the future, then what is the solution there? So these are some of the questions that we need to be asking. Say, how does the law help in endeavors like this? Now, for this next segment, I would like to invite our panelists back to reflect on what the other panelists have, the questions they've raised and the topics that they have raised. And then we can go into the Q&A. So I'd like to get back to Philippe and ask if you've got any observations from Raphael's and Inka's presentations.
Maybe just very briefly and generally, without going into it's not about each other's presentations, I guess, maybe, but it's more what it leads me to new thinking, maybe. I would tend to say that the basic problem that we need to address in the context where we are talking climate change in energy and human rights is the fact that the climate change debate has been entirely biased. Okay, maybe that's not exactly the right word, but has been overwhelmingly focused on energy policies. And that leads us to typically what we're having now, a huge scramble for a shift towards clean energy, which is great in a way, but that stops us from questioning the basis for energy needs in the first place, which is the strategy of development, even rephrased as sustainable development, which has still been business as usual essentially over the past 30 years, and which is the first thing that we need to address. And it's very clear that we cannot just say that we're moving from carbon to no carbon. The NDCs we have are insufficient. It's the UN General Assembly telling us repeatedly, so it's hardly something off the mainstream agenda. We are just not doing what we need to do to address the problem that we are facing, and even the problem in terms of law. I'm not even going beyond the law as it is now, which is the basic 2 degrees of Paris. Now, whether it's enough or not is another question. Just within those 2 degrees that have been framed by world leaders, we are not anywhere getting there. Now,
you muted somehow.
Yes. Sorry, I pressed. In my enthusiasm, I pressed my pad. This is where I would get back then to issues of equity, social equity, inequality, and in terms that can link with, okay, one of the things that Raphael was talking about, investment. I guess at some level, my starting point would be to question the need for all that money in the energy sector. It may be necessary, but since they're limited resources, is that where we need to invest those resources in terms of ensuring the realization of all the human rights related to, okay, let's, even if we limit it to climate change and energy, after all, when we climate change, we have the human right to a clean environment that's recognized in most countries of the world by now. So in that sense, we are not moving in the right direction, partly because the policies are framed still entirely in a top-down fashion. And okay, typically I see that every day when I'm here in Shillong, where I've been for the past 6 months when I go jogging in the forest because of lack of access to energy, but actually lack of provision and lack of investment at the individual or collective level, at the level of, let's say, neighborhoods. People have to go in the forest to cut the trees because they have no other option. So it's not about whether we invest billions and trillions at that level. And similarly with, I'm not sure I follow the point about necessarily the 40, 50 years lock-in for the infrastructure, because if we're talking about individual solar panels in everyone's house, it's a very different way of understanding the way in which we look at energy policy. It's much more complex, that's for sure. It doesn't allow for the big projects that many people in terms of the policymakers want. But since Stephen and Toko have framed it in terms of a human rights perspective, I guess we're forced to restart the discussion there. Okay, I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you. Raphael.
Yeah, I think the big challenge here is I was just thinking something that Philippe mentioned, that his view was that the human right to environment is recognized in many countries, and I would say, I mean, it may be recognized, but it isn't acted upon, because you can read the reports coming out today. The G7 countries are meeting, and they'll be eating, I'm sure, eating and drinking very fine food down in, not too, let's say, closer to Essex than I am, closer, Essex is closer maybe than I am up here in Dundee to where they are down in Cornwall. But the G7 countries continue to invest in fossil fuels. But yet at the same time, we're telling everyone at these UN talks, everyone should go low carbon. And the big message is, if the G7 countries continue to invest in large-scale fossil fuels, that is a major technology lock-in for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it hardly sends a message to other countries, oh, you should go low carbon, when we will do what, when we face a crisis, we will do what we want. And there is an obligation of developed countries to assist developing countries, and I think the target by 2020 was 100 billion per year, and I think it's only reached 60 billion per year. And we hear, if you read the international literature from international institutions, they talk a lot about ambition. And the new ambition is I think they've in essence kept it at 100 billion a year till 2025. So, if we don't have ambitious policy in the developed countries where the money is, where the technological development is happening, how are we going to expect the global south to show similar ambition? How are we going to get the technology transfer to the global south of all these technologies? And what I would say is, someone mentioned on a question about energy justice at an international level. I would say, think about the pandemic. We all brought in emergency legislation in countries around the world to make these vaccines available that aren't tried and tested in, as it were, in the same way, etc., etc. And consider then from the energy perspective, remember energy is the root cause of the majority of CO2 emissions, that the head of the UN, the Secretary General, said last September, all countries should declare a climate emergency. So, isn't it about time we said we want emergency legislation to make sure we stop building any more fossil fuels? And that should start in the developed world, who essentially can afford it. Then if that started in the developed world, that would force faster investment into clean technology, and then that there could be that technology transfer to the global south, as it were. So in a nutshell, I know things are very complex, but if we can do it in terms of global health and get a vaccine solution solved, and you hope in 2 or 3 years we can solve the crisis. If you applied the same approach to energy, we could actually solve the crisis by 2030 if we were far more ambitious.
Thank you. Yinka, please, your observations.
Thank you very much. As the last speaker, I sort of had a chance to comment a little bit on my the previous speakers, but what I would say is that we need to recognize that there are certain people and certain sectors and segments of the world that have to be at the center. A major premise of mine, and again of a lot of people who look here, is that poor people have got to be at the center of energy planning for any country. When you're talking at a global level, the areas where there's energy poverty, those are the areas that really have to be at the center. There's no getting away from that. We are in a this is a global era. This is a global world. Modern energy services are absolutely essential if there is to be any sustainable development at all. But we must also remember that they're really linked to security issues as well. The world security is tied to that to a very great extent. Terrorists generally come from very, very poor areas where there is nothing at all. We really need to remember that. So if you can rephrase, or we can all rephrase this into, oh, well, we're just giving these people something who, for whatever reason, have never been able to do anything by themselves, and change it and let it be something that is enlightened self-interest, then I think it will help, because we're really dealing with very, very knotty issues. And really, I think that Philippe talked about that. Whenever you do bring in the climate impacts on everything as well. And in fact, exactly what I said about modern energy is true about climate change issues as well. They totally impact on sustainable development. And of course, totally on security, as I said in the course of my presentation. So I think that it's important to actually have such countries, or the areas that currently are not quite getting it and might not attain the goal. It's the goal by 2030. It's important to realize that they do need to be differently perceived, because I think a lot of finance is about perception. In fact, a lot of movements are about perception. And you'll find, Thoko, like what you talked about, finance being highest when it's coming to Africa. A lot of it has to do with perception, preconceived notions, and whatever. I mean, using nice words. I could use some other words, but they don't always apply. But the truth is that you look at certain areas and you say, oh, wow, this is a no-go area. But then you look at some and you say, oh, well, I want to go there, even though statistics are worse. That is why, for example, people flock to Cape Town, even though the crime is horrendous. So, I mean, the perception is different. So we need to do that. We need to consciously work towards realizing that there does have to be some finance there. We need to make sure within our countries, we need to make sure that we have the right frameworks in place, the right policy and legislative frameworks in place. We need to have all the right safety valves in place so that investments are not misplaced, or not misplaced, but so that investments are safe. At the end of the day, we do need to realize that cooperation is absolutely essential. I think that says DG 17 at the end of the day. Global cooperation is an imperative. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I would like now to turn to the Q&A session and to invite Brescia to lead on that. Brescia, please.
Thank you, Toko. So we do have a few questions for the panelists. I think we have about 20 minutes. So we'll start with a question from Godswill Agbaitoro, who's a PhD student here at the University of Essex. So Godswill asks, actually to Philippe, he wanted to ask about what do you think about integrating human and environmental rights into processes of meeting SDGs 6 and 7 as a practical way to also establish the nexus through SDG 10? Do you think that more actions that tend to incorporate human and environmental rights can do more to promote the nexus? So it's essentially a question on human rights and SDGs and the nexus that Philippe spoke about. And then I think after that question for Philippe, maybe we'll go for a general question, which has come from an anonymous attendee for all of the panelists, is just on the support that rich countries or the global north, I guess, gives to the global south. How can this be done in a kind of practical way without these appearing as patronizing or being accused of neocolonialism? Perhaps to add something to that question, we could link it a little bit to discussions around the carbon markets, climate regime as well. So that sort of discussion can come into it as well. So we'll start with Philippe and Godswill question, and then the more general question to all.
Okay, I guess on SDGs and human rights, I would start from the perspective that the problem we have with the SDGs is that there is very little reference to human rights, very little integration of human rights. And the targets that we have in a number of the SDGs do not necessarily match up to what we understand the content of human rights to be. Now, okay, with these three sectors, I fully accept that it's difficult because water is not recognized in a binding form at international level yet. So we might want to say that the SDG actually takes the agenda forward. But as long as things are framed in terms of needs, I think we've seen for decades that the needs discourse doesn't take us where we want in terms of a rights perspective, and the rights perspective still has something additional, stronger in terms of entitlements, and that's particularly true, I would think, in the context, in the times we are now, where a number of governments are increasingly unwilling to fulfill their basic duties as representative of the people who've elected them, even when we talk about elected governments. So in that sense, the entitlement discourse is extremely important, and the needs framing may not actually take us where we want. And that's clearly reflected in a way in the fact that it just took one coronavirus. Okay, I know it's big and we've been in it for 15 months, but it just took one crisis like that for suddenly SDGs, as in the target for 2030 to take a serious beating, not just the poverty one, but lots of the others. So clearly that's not enough, as in we want to be able to frame things in a different way if we are to move forward, which I guess doesn't mean junking the SDGs. It just means that using for what they're useful in terms of getting policymakers to recognize that they're accountable to those promises they have made. But if you look at it from a law or human rights perspective specifically, I guess we need to have a parallel discussion from a human rights perspective. And maybe just one last thing. Some of these debates, I'm not sure that it's best to have them at the international level or to focus mostly on the international level, because there are a number of countries in the global south where the debates have gone a lot further ahead, maybe not in terms of implementation, maybe not in terms of enforcement, but in terms of understanding of where we need to move forward. Okay, maybe I'll just take the example of the fact that it's the African and American human rights regimes that have already recognized in terms of international law the right to clean environments, and not the European Convention, even though the European Court has done a lot to add environmental content. So there may be ways also in which we need to reframe the level at which we think about these issues. I'll stop here.
Okay, so Raphael, Yinka, and also Philippe, any thoughts on the question about support from rich countries to developing countries?
Well, it's already outlined in, as it were, within the Paris Agreement that there should be support. So I mentioned previously the 100 billion target. And, I think just going back to a couple of other points in that context, we have to remember some of the statistics, like that the US has 4% of the world's population, but produces, I think it's 25% of the world's CO2 emissions. Of course, it has a responsibility to nearly every other nation to do something on reducing its carbon dioxide emissions. And that's what I think we need to remember here. We need to remember the high amount, also in China, the growing high amount in India. And, there is a responsibility to think about, if you want other countries to be low carbon, well, probably the easiest way is if they don't go off and build low carbon, there's enough. So if they don't go off and build carbon CO2 producing assets, and therefore those nations that produce a lot of CO2, they should really be supporting any nation who wants to produce less CO2. And we should remember that, I think it's a very good point that was touched on, is, there is great work by some economists that show the people who are affected most by carbon dioxide emissions are low-income people all over the world, whether it's a developed country or developing country. The majority of people who are affected, because generally they live near the energy sites, they live near the places that are more highly polluted. And we should remember that this is, the less CO2 we have will enable us to reduce generally societal inequality. And increasingly, we are getting more and more data to show this. So, for example, here in the UK, you can actually show how much it's going to cost, how much it costs someone, depending on where they live, to the public health system. So you can actually say, well, if you lived near a coal plant, you will cost X amount more than if you lived somewhere else. And we can think about the data from just two cases, one legal case in Kenya and one in Australia, both in 2019. And they could basically, both were involved coal projects, and they could basically show that the socio-economic gains for those local communities, in essence, they were a myth. And the judges in both cases said, these are scarcely believable. And that's what I would say is, not only are those benefits that we talk about benefits from energy development, but I actually believe the benefits from renewable energy are greater, because you are employing local people to help develop the project, local people to help operate and maintain the project. You're providing greater energy security to the people in that region and also nationally. And let's also not forget that a lot of the money can stay in the country. Remember, most big energy project development that's fossil fuels, the money is leaving the country. And this happens whether you're in a developed world or developing world. And we can see the money exits the country through subsidiary companies, et cetera, all the tax issues. And I would question, I haven't seen full economic analysis on it. I'm not fully an economist, but I'd be interested to see if there was economic studies that would show actually renewable energy project leaves more wealth in a country than any type of fossil fuel project.
I'd like to say, when looking at the question, how do rich countries give support to developing countries without appearing patronizing or being accused of neo-colonialism? I think it's fairly straightforward. Those that are being neo-colonialists are obviously being so to a great extent. I mean, if you look at Chinese investments, they come out clearly and say what they want. And by the time you look, you see that if you're not careful, you might just have sold your whole country. Now, we cannot make a case for having a responsible leadership under any circumstances. The leadership simply has to be responsible in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, without naming anyone's. But I do have to say that we need to move from a needs narrative to a narrative of common shared interest, because I think that is what is going to help with the solution. So don't let it not be presented as, oh, a lot of very kind countries helping those that just don't have much, because self-interest is a major issue, major issue in the international system, so to speak. We should be talking about common or shared interests, and we should actually be asking for help with the technology and the finance to build non-carbon infrastructure. We have to have the infrastructure. When in the West you're talking about people with energy issues, they're not like some of the ones that you'd have seen if my screen had allowed me to show you people who live with carbon in the real sense, low biomass, cooking with firewood, with yellow flames in front of a pot. You can't say that they're not going to have energy. So the challenge is to help them grow, assist the governments or the people to help them grow, and to basically grow with non-carbon infrastructure. It is possible. The decentralized grids can go a long way. Clean cooking fuels. I mean, there's a lot around all over the place. The challenge is for it to go around and to go to the right places, I think.
Philippe, did you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, we can go to the next couple of questions.
No, I'm sure you have lots of other questions.
Okay, thank you. So then I'll take two more questions and do them as a group. So we have a question, well, actually, it's on energy justice at the international level from Chitsi Ogumbada, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I think Raphael already kind of answered this, but we can have some general thoughts just on energy justice at the international level, but also bringing in this, the question of a green transition, just transition, sorry. Perhaps in a way contrasting it with the discuss around the Green New Deal, and if there's a kind of conflict there happening at the international level in terms of people talking about a Green New Deal and then other groups, unions, etc., talking about just transition. And then we have another question from God's Will. This time is for Yinka, but it can also be answered more generally. His question is really getting at whether we should be looking at these things from a more country-specific, perhaps region-specific, rather than talking in a more generalized, abstract sense. So he's saying that there's a lot of good work that tends to generalize the approach to be taken, whereas the challenges on the ground differ for different countries. Do you think an understanding of not only the nature of energy challenges, but how they specifically affect countries is important to developing a country-specific solution? So perhaps if we go in reverse order this time, we'll go to Yinka first, Raphael, and then Philippe.
Okay, thank you. I think I have God's Will's question, and really the simple answer is yes. The truth is that you have to not only be country-specific, at the end of the day, development is one person at a time, really. And then you try and scale up the impact and affect a lot of people. The challenges in countries are different. I will say that I might be concentrating on the lack more and talking generally, because there's such a lot that has to be done. But definitely any activity has got to be country specific. In fact, within the countries has to be specific as regards even the regions there. What is needed in the north of Nigeria that is arid and where there's a lot of desert will be very different from what is needed in the Niger Delta area where there's a lot of swamp. There are some places that will be windy. So we do have to address it in a very concerted fashion, but it is recognized that certain regions are lagging behind more than others. And I think I'll stop here, bearing in mind that we're all talking. Thank you.
Raphael, did you want?
Yeah, so let's say in response to a couple, I'll try and answer the questions together. I would just say that you know, we do have to speak in a general sense. I mean, we can have more dedicated conference on specific countries or a selection of countries. But when we speak in a general sense, I mean, it's very easy to, you know, it should be very easy to agree, because essentially this is about science. I mean, if you keep building fossil fuel infrastructure, you'll keep producing carbon emissions. It's as simple as that. And I think if, you know, we should be thinking globally on, you know, is there a way of having as others have commented, you know, more global cooperation, and is there a way of having justice actually applied more, you know, more globally? And I spoke about it within the sort of courtrooms that we are beginning to see it, but that's, you know, that's coming from a national led perspective than international. But you know, so I do think there should be more action there. I do think the just transition to a low carbon economy is very good. I don't think there's much conflict with the Green Deal. But then just to go into the final question on the proper pricing of carbon, yeah, I think that has a huge role to play. We should remember that there are huge subsidies still given to fossil fuels, and I would agree. I think if I understand Jinka correctly, I mean, there is a lot of, I would agree with her that there, you know, a lot of the technologies already exist, but the problem is, how do you roll them out? And I would say the big thing that is preventing us from rolling these out faster is because all the way around the energy life cycle, fossil fuels receive some type of subsidy. And that subsidy prevents a faster rollout of all these beneficial technologies. And I would just ask, you know, leave you with the thought of, we started producing coal in a commercial way, you know, over 200 years ago. And why hasn't that industry updated and innovated itself? And I would say, you know, if I told you to take, you know, some medicine from 200 years ago to solve the pandemic, you would turn around and laugh in my face. So why aren't we turning around to the coal industry and laughing in their face, saying, we don't need your technology anymore? You know, you've barely innovated in 200 years, and all these other innovations have happened. And you know, I think it's a scandal that we continue to subsidize coal. You know, this is an old technology. And just think the same way, if I gave you a mobile phone from 30 years ago, you know, it would probably take up, if you were traveling on a plane, that's probably the only thing you could board the plane with was your big brick of a mobile phone. You could just take that on. You couldn't bring anything else on. And you would say, no, I don't think so. I want one of the latest ones. And I think we should be demanding of our policymakers, why can't we have the best and latest technology?
Okay, I'll follow up also by trying to answer all the different points together in a way. I would say okay, that's a shortcut, I know, but whether we call it energy justice, we call it just transition, we call it human rights, these are different languages we can use that can take us in a similar direction. Okay, it depends on how we frame it, and it depends on who frames it, how, and who owns the discourse. So there may be things that need to be discussed in more specific terms after that. Second thing, in terms of energy justice, again, to throw in one big thing, which is not new also, but we still do it, maybe even here in the discussion we are having, because of the way in which the law is structured, we're still constantly talking about something at the international level, something at the national level, forgetting that strict barrier between the two, the fence that was erected centuries ago, has long broken down. But the fiction of international and national being completely different still stays at various levels, and that's one of the problems. That's one of the things that stops us from being able to see ahead or see beyond what we have today. Now, in terms of trying to link the different substantive issues, I'll go back to one more local issue. Okay, and just for the avoidance of doubt, I wasn't trying to say that we should not move away from carbon. But now the thing is, in North India, I guess now we see it in the international media often, North India is essentially dying, as if there are millions of people with official data, non-official data, whatever. But I think more and more clearly, it's millions of people a year dying from air pollution. India is indeed still investing massively in coal. So a part of that is coal and other fossil fuel, as well as many other things. So it's not just the energy or just the fuels. But that shows that it's not a question of just talking about it in terms of climate, in terms of international issues. People are dying on the ground. They have human rights. Okay, there's human right to a clean environment, which is recognized, but probably not enforced. These are the kind of things where we are forced to make the link between the local and the global, and in principle, pressure at the local level would be what leads the government to change, whether the G7 is doing their bit or not, because it's in terms of people suffering within their own countries, regardless of whether the planet is suffering or not. It may also be suffering at the same time, but that's in a way an additional dimension. And I'll just add one last point. Coal, okay, we can just say, obviously, we would like to be able to say, let's just move away from coal because we have better, better technological options. But typically in the state where I'm now in Meghalaya, which is one of the few states where coal is not mined on a large scale basis by large government/corporate actors, there is an issue of livelihood. You can't just say tomorrow morning, we will not mine coal. It's livelihoods, but livelihood is also labor rights, human rights. So again, here we need all that, but we need all that within a framework that recognizes all the different dimensions that come together. Otherwise, we'll end up with results that are even worse than what we have today, typically for the poorest people, who are the people going down those so-called rat holes in this state. Okay, it may be a specific, very local issue, but it's a state with lots of natural resources and not very rich within the Indian context. So we are fully within that context of how do you develop, and if development is still the only option we have ahead, we may not be able to avoid mining coal for quite some time for a variety of reasons, all worse than the other in a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time, but I'll give it back to Toko for the last word.
Okay, I think I should just thank our panelists for engaging with this series of interesting issues. And as Rafaela said, I think all these topics would be suitable for a proper conference when we could look at the questions that emerge, because at the end of the day, what we would like to see is a just transition in these states of the global south, a just transition that ensures that livelihoods are protected, that families have got access to modern energy sources, be they dispersed or on a central grid and all of that. The questions about finance, the questions about the legal frameworks that deliver these projects and what those frameworks look like. And so I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation further. There's already a number of references that our panelists shared with you, but also some upcoming journal collections on this particular topic that we'll be happy to share with you. So again, thank you, Philippe, Raphael, and Yinka. I'm so glad that you were able to make this appointment. I know during this season of Corona and all of that, there's so many requests because everyone thinks that everyone is available on Zoom, but I know that it's not that easy. So thank you a lot. And I'd like to thank our attendees for making it into this session, and for my co-organizers at Essex. Thank you for creating this space when we could look at many of these issues that are really relevant for many polities in the global south. And thank you. All right. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.